Breaking news, Canon has leaked two brand new cameras, the Canon R7 and the Canon R10. I'll tell you about those and tell you why Canon decided to kill off the entire M system. But first, I need to thank our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace makes incredible websites incredibly easy. In just a few minutes, you can drag your own pictures in, rearrange them, choose a style that matches your brand. You can have a store and sell prints, take appointments from clients, view detailed analytics to know who is visiting your site and how they got there. Just start at squarespace.com/Tony. Once you love it, use the coupon code Tony and you can get 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace, and thank you to CanonRumors.com for bringing us these detailed specs. First, let's start with the more exciting camera, the Canon R7. This is the natural mirrorless evolution of a camera that we absolutely loved. This was our main sports and wildlife camera for many years, the 7D Mark II. This DSLR was known for having 10 frames per second, and though it was an APS-C camera with a smaller sensor, it had a totally professional build. It was known as the Baby 1D. For most people, that smaller APS-C sensor was considered a disadvantage. It would give you worse low light performance, less detail in your portraits. But for wildlife photographers specifically, the high megapixels and small sensor actually gave you greater pixel density, allowing you to get more detail out of your telephoto lenses. As a wildlife photographer, this was so useful because you pretty much always end up cropping anyway. So you basically were shooting with a high megapixel camera, but you didn't have to deal with high megapixel files. The new R7 follows in that heritage, providing similar functionality, but with even greater megapixels. 32.5 megapixels in an APS-C sensor. That gives you the pixel density of a full frame 83 megapixel camera. That means that this little APS-C camera would give you more detailed wildlife images when you would have to crop anyway than you would even get out of an R5 or Sony Alpha 1. This is going to be something that Sony does not have the equivalent for. It is going to have sensor stabilization like any pro camera should. This helps increase the number of sharp shots that you get, especially when using those big telephotos. 15 frames per second doesn't sound impressive, but that's only with the mechanical shutter. That's 50% more frames per second with the mechanical shutter, which should pretty much eliminate any sort of rolling shutter. That's what you would use when using like rapidly moving subjects like the wings of a hummingbird if you wanted to eliminate that motion. For subjects that aren't quite so erratic like a soaring eagle, you could switch to the 30 frames per second electronic shutter. We use the electronic shutter in the R5 all the time, but it's only 20 frames per second. So this would be a big advantage for both pixel density and frames per second. It will be outfitted with two UHS 2 SD cards. Seeing two SD cards on a camera with 30 frames per second and 30 megapixels, well, that's going to be a bottleneck. That means that the camera is going to buffer like crazy. This camera really needed to have a CF Express Type B card. I think this spec might even be wrong because the previous 7D had a CF Express with an SD card, just like the R5 has. If that spec is true, it's a mistake. Let's talk about the leaked specs from the R7 for video. It's going to have 4K at 60 frames per second. Now the big question is, will this be cropped or will it be full width? If it's full width, that'll be quite an accomplishment with 32 megapixels, and it'll do 1080 HD at 120 frames per second for those of you who need slow motion. And they're going to include C-Log3 and HDR picture quality. That doesn't mean that it's going to have RAW like its big brother the R5, but that should provide plenty of dynamic range, and that's always what we use instead of RAW anyway, because RAW is simply too heavy. Now the real question for the video enthusiasts is, will it have a flip screen? The old 7D didn't have a tilting screen at all. It simply had a fixed screen. But Canon has been putting flip screens on everything. Love you for that, Canon, including the R5 and the professional-oriented R3. So why wouldn't they put a flip screen on the new R7? I think they will. What's the price of this going to be? Well, it's APS-C, so they're going to be hard-pressed to charge more than they would for a full-frame Canon R6, but it does have a higher frames per second, a much higher pixel density, and a very specific niche target audience. So I'm thinking the price point for this is going to be about $2,500. That is really tough. That is significantly more than, say, a Sony a7 III, which is an excellent all-around camera. But a Sony a7 III, I would never recommend it for wildlife, and this camera is sounding like it is purpose-built for wildlife photography. And as a wildlife enthusiast, I know there are so many of you out there who want a really good purpose-built rig and don't necessarily care that much about the price. Let's face it, once you get the obsession of wildlife photography, you could be dropping thousands and thousands of dollars left and right. Now let's talk about the Canon R10. I'm inferring a lot from the name R10. I think this is the next evolution of the Canon M10. The M10 is one of Canon's most compact interchangeable lens cameras that they've ever made. It totally lacked a viewfinder. Instead, it had a flip up screen. So it was really built for casual photographers, for creators. This is a rapidly shrinking market. So many people who fit into this category and bought the M10 are now using their smartphones because the functionality is really very, very similar. But a lot of those people still do want a camera and they want it to be cheap. Like the R7, this is going to be an APS-C sensor, not a full frame sensor. I do think it'll have a flip screen. CanonRumors.com says it'll be a 24 megapixel sensor. I personally don't think they will put sensor stabilization in here. Instead, I think they will build optical image stabilization into the basic kit lens because that is cheaper for them to do. CanonRumors.com is saying it's going to have 15 frames per second with a mechanical shutter, and that would surprise me. But maybe they've decided to use the same mechanical shutter from the R7. And an awful lot of people looking for entry-level cameras are doing so because they want to photograph their kids' sports, because that's one thing they really can't do well with a smartphone. It would rise up to 23 frames per second when shooting with the electronic shutter. Being a very consumer-oriented entry-level camera, this would only have a single UHS 2 SD card slot. I think Canon wants to target their existing M-mount audience, so I think this is going to come in at about $600 now. And then maybe by Christmas or maybe by next year, we'll see the price drop down to $500. Canon Rumors says these will be announced on May 24th, this month coming up really soon, and they'll start shipping in like June or July or so. Now let's talk about the new APS-C lenses designed for these new upcoming cameras. The rumors are there will be two of them. The first of the two lenses is a basic kit lens, an 18 to 45 millimeter f3.5 to 5.6, which in full frame equivalent terms makes it a 29 to 72 millimeter f5.6 to f9. Already, I've got a huge problem with this, and it's not even officially announced yet. I'll tell you why. Let's look at the Nikon kit lens. That is a 16 to 50 lens, which puts it in full frame equivalent terms at 24 to 75 millimeters. That means that while Nikon shooters would be at 24 millimeters at the wide end, Canon shooters would be at 29 millimeters, and that's a big difference. Let me show you. This is 24 millimeters, and this is 29 millimeters, a little tight. In my own real world usage, I find 20 to 24 millimeters to be about right. Once you get to 29 millimeter, stuff starts to be crowded, not just arm length vlogging, but sitting across from people at the restaurant when you just want to photograph their birthday dinner. 29 millimeters, a little too tight. You find yourself like leaning back like this. I think Canon needs to make these kit lenses wider, especially considering that they have the 1.6x crop factor instead of the 1.5x crop factor. Their smaller sensor means that the same millimeter listing actually provides you a tighter angle of view. This is a mistake, Canon. The second lens is the one that I would prefer. I prefer these super zoom lenses. This is an 18 to 150 millimeter f3.5 to 6.3. In full frame equivalent terms, that is 29 to 240 millimeters. This makes it the perfect focal length for walking around, travel photography, sports, even entry-level wildlife stuff. Like you could certainly capture deer and foxes, if not small birds at a feeder. That's the new gear, but I've totally buried the lead. The lead is that the M mount is dead. Canon is basically competing with themselves here. And Canon's not gonna announce that the M mount is dead. They're gonna say that it's going to continue. But are we ever going to see any more lenses from it? Frankly, we haven't seen any new lenses in a really long time. It makes no sense for Canon to have two APS-C mirrorless interchangeable lens mounts. In fact, I would say that making the M mount in the first place was a huge strategic mistake. When Canon was designing the M mount, they should have made the mount just a little bit bigger so that they could accommodate full frame lenses in the future. Here's my thing, I kind of hate all of this because I teach photography. I help people choose the camera and lens that they're going to buy. And having a single mount with both APS-C and full frame sensors and lenses is completely confusing to the average consumer. Not too long ago, I saw somebody shooting a Sony A7 R3, a 42 megapixel full frame camera, and they were using Sony's 16 to 50 APS-C kit lens on it. That means that that 42 megapixel camera was only producing 18 megapixels of detail because it was cropping the image down to that APS-C lens. Also, they chose this super high megapixel, no AA filter, high quality camera because it produced great images. But they didn't know that they were putting a lens on there that was very low quality. This is all really hard for your mom or dad to figure out, right? Up until now, Canon's R mount had been immune to a lot of those problems. If you bought the entry-level $900 Canon RP, you could use any R mount lenses and not have to worry about any complicated crop factor math. That means that every lens you might buy would be 100% compatible with every future camera that you might upgrade to. That actually made upgrades easier for Canon shooters. If they decided to upgrade from the RP to the R5 because they wanted better wildlife or sports performance, they didn't have to worry about whether their current kit lens would work properly with it. But if you buy an M10 with an APS-C kit lens and then you upgrade to the R5, well, now you'd also have to get rid of your kit lens. So I personally am really bummed to see Canon go back down this rabbit hole of having a split lineup. In fact, they could have put these resources into making lower end full frame gear that was less expensive, but didn't have these compatibility problems. The fact is, low end cameras are disappearing from the marketplace as everybody decides that their smartphones are pretty good. And when I have compared these basic APS-C cameras like what the M10 will be to a modern smartphone, the modern smartphone wins in most situations, and it offers so much more convenience, and it's waterproof, and you have it in your pocket all the time. So I actually think these are a really hard sell. But with the full frame sensor, a lot of those problems start to go away, especially when you have that nice and easy upgrade path to higher quality full frame lenses. The problem with most of the APS-C systems, Fuji aside, is that the camera manufacturers don't make great lenses for APS-C. They only make consumer grade lenses that really don't significantly differentiate themselves from the little tiny lenses in your smartphone. I would have rather have seen Canon focus on making an incredibly inexpensive full frame sensor and driving the price point down to a $500 full frame camera with an incredibly cheap full frame lens on it, just so that they can more easily upgrade. I think that would have been the better and more profitable path for Canon in the long term, but maybe not the short term. So why would Canon do that? I can actually understand their reasoning. First, smaller sensors are going to be cheaper. Fact of the matter is, you can fit more APS-C sensors on a single die than you can full frame sensors. They tend to have a higher yield too. Also, an inexpensive full frame camera could cannibalize their higher end full frame offerings. Sure, a $500 full frame Canon would basically kill the Fuji X mount, the APS-C, Sony, and Nikon lineups as consumers saw that low price point and wanted the bigger sensor. But they would also cannibalize their own higher end cameras. By offering a low end full frame camera, people might not want to spring $1,000 for a Canon RP. Because the fact of the matter is, people see the sensor size as one of the most important differentiators. So by not lowering the bar to entry to full frame, they are going to pull some people up. Also, this is super easy for Canon. I complain they aren't pouring these resources into making new full frame R mount lenses, but they're just probably recycling their existing M APS-C mirrorless lens designs. They have all the tech specs for these. They just need to repackage it into an R mount body and ship it to customers. So the R&D that they went into this is pretty minimal, actually. In the comments down below, tell me what you think. Me personally, I'm very excited for the R7. I would love a more powerful wildlife camera, and I do not mind the crop at all. The R10, well, for people looking for an entry-level camera, I think it might actually be just the thing. Don't forget to subscribe to see future videos, including our reviews of these two cameras when they are launched, and check out our sponsor, Squarespace, to make a website for yourself, a professional website. I know you have Instagram and TikTok and Twitter, but those are social media apps. I learned this the hard way with Facebook. I built up like 250,000 followers, and then Facebook changed the algorithm. And now I can't reach anybody on Facebook unless I pay them. And when people do visit our Facebook page, it's like filled with ads and garbage and all this literally advertising from competitors can appear on your social media. You need a professional web presence. Whether your business is photography or video or a restaurant or a dentist's office, head to squarespace.com/Tony. Set it up free. Just see how amazing it is. When you're ready to get your own private domain, like your last name or the name of your business, which looks so much more professional than gmail.com, use the coupon code TONY and that'll give you 10% off. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this, and thank you for watching us and supporting us. Bye.